This is not the item the buyer returned on eBay. In fact, they didn't use any packaging at all. That's right, no box, no bubble wrap, no foam, no nothing. Just slap a label on the item and send it back. In this video, I'm going to tell you about one of the most expensive returns that I've ever had on the eBay platform. How I'm changing a simple setting on my eBay account to help fight these returns. And yes, I'm still going to be offering returns, but with a very specific setting turned on. You don't want to miss the story about this return and what eBay said when I reached out to them. But if you're only here to learn about what the setting is, go ahead and skip to this part in the video where I break down what the setting is and how I'm changing it. In my last video, I covered the worst items to sell on the eBay platform. And this item actually broke two of my specific guidelines on selling items on eBay. Not only was this an expensive, brand new sealed item, but this item was also very large, heavy, and expensive to ship. In fact, the only reason I decided to sell this item on eBay was because the profit margin was large enough. For me, across my reselling business, my average cost of goods is $4.40. And my average sales price is $49.70. This particular item I paid up for. I paid $50 for this item at an estate sale, but it was brand new, sealed in the box, and it sells for over $300. Now, $50 on an item might not sound like a lot, especially when it sells for over $300, but for me and my business, this was actually a lot of money to spend on an item. This is almost 10x my average cost of goods of $4.40. Therefore, I consider this item to be something that I paid up for. But because the profit margin was so large, I went ahead and paid up for this item and I broke two of my guidelines. I bought an expensive, brand new sealed item and it was very large and heavy to ship. It was a 3-in-1 printer. You know, one of those big, large printers that you'll often see at an office or a small business. This printer not only had a great profit margin considering I was only paying $50 for it, but it also had an amazing sell-through rate. There were more of these items sold than even listed on the eBay platform. Therefore, this was a no-brainer for me to pick it up. The one thing to note, because this is going to come up again later, is that this item is only worth something when it's brand new and sealed in the box. In fact, there were a lot of these printers listed in used condition and open box condition that were not selling. There were none sold in used condition, and the ones that were listed weren't even listed enough to cover the cost of shipping the item out. But this was no problem for me because mine was brand new and factory sealed. When the printer sold, I didn't even have a box to ship it because it was so large. So I ran to Home Depot and I bought one of those big boxes and I brought it home and I packed this printer like a piece of delicate glass. This means that I double boxed it inside of the box from Home Depot and I wrapped it in some thick foam sheets that I had and some bubble wrap. This item was packed very well and it became very expensive to ship this item after it was double boxed and wrapped in all this foam. By the time I bought the box and the shipping label, it cost me just over $50 to ship this item to the customer. I dropped the item off at FedEx and I didn't hear anything for a few days. Then I received the dreaded return request. And I thought to myself, great, this item probably arrived broken or damaged. But I also knew that I had put insurance on this item, so it wasn't a big deal. I went onto my computer, I opened up the return request, and I saw that it was actually for the item is defective and not working. I went and I read the reason for it, and they just simply put, the printer does not work. And for the picture section of the return request, they took a sheet of white paper, put it on a table, and they took a picture of this blank sheet of paper. This was real helpful. This was something that I would be able to help them fix since they gave me so much information about why the printer wasn't working. But I honestly thought, no big deal. Printers can kind of be a little bit difficult to set up, especially if you're not tech savvy. So I thought if I reached out to this buyer immediately and offered some good customer service, I might be able to get them to not return this printer. So that's what I did. I immediately sent the buyer a message with some basic troubleshooting steps, some phone numbers and information and manuals for the printer that they had purchased, and I asked them for more information about what was wrong with the printer and why it was broken. The buyer, of course, didn't respond to this message. In fact, the buyer didn't respond and just sent the item back the very next day. Now, I always have all my items shipped to my P.O. box. So I went to my P.O. box and I had a slip. I took that slip up to the guy at the front desk, and he went in the back and he came around the corner carrying the box of the printer. Like, no double box, no foam, no padding, nothing. And the box looked like it had been ran over, dropped, and kicked multiple times. He knows me pretty well at this point, as I'm always dropping packages off daily at this post office. He actually said to me, I saw this item come in and I couldn't believe that they shipped it in this condition. And I said, yeah, me either. Now, this was no fault of the Postal Service. This item was never designed to be shipped in the factory box. These factory boxes are designed to be put on a pallet and shipped to stores and displayed in stores. They're not designed to be shipped through the Postal Service. Hence the reason I double boxed it, wrapped it in foam and bubble wrap. But the buyer decided that all they needed to do was throw the printer in the factory box, slap the label on the outside, and send it back. So just to get this right, the buyer bought a printer, received the printer, opened up the printer, couldn't figure out how to use it, got frustrated, opened a return request, provided no information on the return request of what the actual problem was. When I reached out to the buyer and offered customer service and some troubleshooting steps, they failed to respond back to that. They took the printer, they threw it in the factory box with no padding, no nothing. They threw a $300 printer in a box to rattle around. They slapped a label on the outside of that box and dropped it off at their postal service. That's right, just a $300 printer rattling around inside of a factory box with a label on the outside. Now, this is all just part of running any business. There's always going to be returns, there's always going to be bad customers, and there's always going to be problems that arise. And eBay is no different. But to be perfectly honest, I was completely pissed that the buyer shipped the item back to me in this condition. Now, I am top rated, which means I am able to withhold 50% of the refund if the item is returned in a different condition than it was sent out in. Therefore, I did withhold the 50% refund. Now, from my personal experience with eBay, this is about all the seller protection they're going to offer on this kind of case. When you get an item back, whether it's broken, whether it's damaged, as long as you get the item back, eBay is going to make you return at least 50% of the refund. That's what I did. I went on, I reported the buyer, I took detailed notes and photographs of everything that was wrong with the item, and I sent the buyer the 50% refund. eBay used to let you withhold the original shipping during this process as well. However, for some reason, that is no longer an option. Therefore, I was out well over $100 on shipping because I had to pay for the original shipping, which was about $50, and the return shipping back to me. Now, something that has never sat quite right with me with eBay is the fact that they keep their fees. That's right. So if you withhold any amount from a refund on an INAD, eBay keeps all of their fees. And in my case, this was well over $50 in general transaction fees and promoted listing fees. So I decided to reach out to eBay and see what they would do. Now, I do believe eBay tries to keep these fees and not be truthful to the seller and even tell you that they're keeping these fees, because they want these fees, because a lot of times when you offer that 50% or that partial refund to the buyer is going to open up a case. And I have seen it in almost every case when the buyer opens up something and complains about the partial refund, eBay is just going to give them the full refund. They're not going to take it from me, the seller, but they're going to rather take it out of their own pocket and give it to them. I think eBay's keeping these fees as a way of being able to refund that buyer later on without having to take money out of their own pocket. Now, to be fair, I rarely withhold any money from buyers. If the buyer bought an item and they return it in a condition that I can resell it in, they return the same item, whatever it is, I try to be nice and I try to give the buyer their money back, especially since eBay's going to keep the fees. When eBay keeps the fees, it means that I have to withhold even more to account for those fees. Sometimes the difference between giving the buyer a full refund and losing out on the fees, or giving the buyer the full refund and eBay gives me back those fees, is only a few dollars difference. So I'd rather not have the hassle And like I said, most times I'm trying to take care of the buyer. But in cases like this, when the buyer just clearly doesn't give a crap and throws the item back in the box, and it's an expensive item and I'm having to pay shipping both ways, and it's clear that the buyer doesn't care, I am going to use all of my seller protections. Now, just a quick note, this fee thing only applies to INAD returns. So eBay will keep all of their fees from your transaction if you withhold any amount of money from that transaction if it's on a INAD return. Now, if you just offer the buyer a partial refund because there was something wrong with it and they don't open up a return request, eBay will prorate your fees depending on how much you give back to the buyer. However, when it's an INAD return, eBay keeps all the fees. I've seen this time and time again. So I messaged eBay and I explained to them what was happening, and I told them that it didn't feel right that everyone made money off of this transaction except for me. And eBay kept well over $50 on a transaction where the buyer just threw the item back in the box. The customer service rep that I got was actually super friendly and super helpful, and he said he was going to look into it, and he said, "We never want you to feel like you are the one left out in the cold while everyone else profits." Now, I actually find this pretty funny because of what happens next. So he says all of this and that he's going to look into the case. He goes and looks into the case. He reaches back out to me and says that I did the right thing in offering the 50% refund and that he's going to go ahead and refund me the transaction fees, which I was super surprised. Like, good on eBay, good on this customer service rep. I followed up thanking him for this, but I had a question. Was that just the transaction fees or was that also the promoted ad fees? He kind of gave me back a vague response of something like, "I'm going to refund you back the transaction fees." He completely ignored the direct question I asked him, which led me to believe he wasn't going to refund the promoted ad fees. So I asked him again. And then he clearly stated that it was only going to be the transaction fees and not the promoted ad fees. So I do find this kind of funny that they don't want anyone to profit, but they're still only willing to give up so much of their fees. But to be perfectly honest, I was completely happy. I actually didn't expect to get anything back from eBay, and most platforms that you sell on, including Amazon, don't offer any kind of seller protections for problems like this. So the fact that eBay allows me to withhold 50% and then gave me back my transaction fees, that's a huge win for eBay. I want to make it very clear that I am not bashing on eBay about this return. This is something that's just going to happen. Buyers are going to get items that are brand new. Buyers are going to have trouble setting up the item. Buyers are going to return these items, and we as sellers are going to end up eating this cost. However, eBay does allow us to withhold some, and they did give me back my transaction fees, which is a huge win on eBay's behalf. Now, right before I started recording this video, I actually had the buyer open up a case about this item. The buyer was super mad that she only got a partial refund, and I actually don't even blame her. To be fair, I recognize the fact that she may have gotten this item, and this item may in fact not have worked. There's a chance that this was a factory dud. There's a chance that this did break in shipping. There's a chance that this item was just actually broken. But I completely hate and disagree with the way the buyer handled this problem. If the buyer was having trouble setting up this item or getting this item to work, and me as the seller immediately reaches out and offers some solutions and wants more information, and the buyer doesn't respond to that and instead takes this expensive item and just throws it back in the box, ignores the double box, ignores all the foam, ignores all the bubble wrap, ignores all the factory packaging, and just throws it back in the box, slaps a label on the outside, and sends it back, I believe the buyer is in the wrong. It's also critical to note that the buyer never said that the item arrived damaged or broken. They never took pictures of the box saying that, hey, this item arrived and it looks like it was dropped, it looks like it was broken. So I tend to believe that this item did arrive at the buyer in a condition that they would have opened the item and tried to use the item. This also leads me to believe that this was just a setup issue rather than an actually broken item. The chances that HP is sending out items that are actually broken is very slim. The chances that this item broke in shipping are also very slim unless there was clear damage to the item. And the fact that the buyer didn't even explain anything that was wrong with it and rather just said that the printer doesn't work and took a picture of a blank sheet of paper tells me a lot. So when the buyer opened up this case, they actually did include more information. And it's kind of crazy how this works. As soon as the buyer realizes that they have the possibility of losing out on money, they go a little bit further and explain what the issues are. So the buyer in the case actually told eBay that the item wouldn't calibrate. This would have been super helpful for me because there was steps that I could have sent them to help them calibrate this printer. But when they tell me that it doesn't work in the return request, and then once they get their partial refund, they go and tell eBay all these other things that were wrong with it, this is information that I would have liked up front. The other thing that the buyer noted in the case is that they returned the item in the factory box. Now, I find this kind of funny because this is exactly why I withheld the money in the first place. And I stated it in the partial refund. I stated to the buyer that the partial refund was due to the fact that it was shipped in a poor manner in the factory box. The buyer actually admits in the case that they shipped it back in the factory box, and they said the item was returned in the original factory box designed for consumer shipping. I completely disagree. Those boxes that those items are shipped in are designed for store shelves or designed for pallets. They're not designed to be shipped through the Postal Service. The Postal Service is going to drop this item. And the fact that they didn't put any of the packaging in the item and just rather let this printer rattle around inside, I don't even know what they're arguing here. They're actually just agreeing with me that they sent it back in the factory box. The final thing they noted in this case, which I find super interesting, is that they searched on Amazon and found this printer for cheaper. Now, I don't know why they included this, nor does it really matter at this point, but I do find it interesting that they admit to price shopping the item and finding it cheaper. So it makes me question whether they ended up getting this item and rather than having to pay to ship it back and lose this money, they found it on sale on Amazon for cheaper and they bought it there and just wanted to return this item. I don't know. I'll never know. I'll never know whether it was truly broken. I'll never know whether they just price shopped the item. And honestly, none of this actually matters. The fact is that they not only ignored any offers of help to fix the item, but they also just threw the item back in the box and ignored packing the item correctly to make sure that it arrived back to me in any kind of sellable condition. My goal with this video is to educate people on the risks of selling on the eBay platform. Now, eBay is great if you're a business. If you're a business like me and you're just buying things and reselling them for a profit, it's fine. Like, I'm willing to accept that I lost money on this transaction. It's not the end of the world. However, eBay is also marketed to your casual seller, to the person that has some collectibles around the house, to the person that's cleaning out their father's house after they've passed away. Whatever it is, eBay is kind of the place that people will often sell these items. And I think that there's a huge risk involved, especially if you are emotionally invested in these items or if you have financial investment in these items. So think about selling something fragile that was your father's and the person doesn't like it and they just throw it back in the box like this and ship it back to you. And you end up with a return and it's completely broken. You might be heartbroken to have this happen. So I want you to avoid selling items that you are emotionally invested in. And the same with financial things. So if you spent a lot of money on an item and you don't have the means to cover the shipping both ways, don't sell it on eBay. Like I said, I spent over $100 just on the shipping of this item to the customer and back. That's money that I had to pay out because I didn't make any money on this item. So if you have a lot of financial money tied up in an item or you're emotionally invested in an item, just don't sell it on eBay. It's just not worth the risk. Before we get into the return setting that I'm going to be using moving forward, I have a quick favor to ask you. YouTube just released this new feature called Hype. If you go down below the video here, there's a little icon and all you have to do is click that hype button. It doesn't cost you anything and it's designed specifically for small channels to be able to grow. The hype button is only available for small channels and only available for the first 7 days after a video has been released. So if you could go down below and hit that hype button. And while you're down there, hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of the future content that I have coming out. My frustration with this whole return is the fact that the buyer never gave me an opportunity to fix their issue. Now, I'm not claiming that I would have been able to fix the issue, and I'm not even claiming that there was an issue. Maybe there was something else going on there. However, the buyer never gave me the time to actually do it because they never responded to my messages, and they returned the item the very next day after opening the return request. And the whole reason this happened is because of the way I have my settings on eBay. I want my returns automatic. I don't want to be emotionally involved in the returns. Right now, when I get a return, what happens is eBay handles it. eBay sees the return come in, eBay gives the buyer the return label, and the only thing I have to do is get the return, look at it, and refund the buyer. I don't like having to read returns. I don't like having to look at them, and I just want to be emotionally removed from the return process. However, that's about to change. The problem with this method is that there's no incentive for the buyer to actually communicate with me. When the buyer got this printer, they got frustrated by it. They immediately hopped on, opened a return request. They were probably so frustrated that they didn't want to take pictures. They didn't want to explain what was wrong with it, and they didn't want to pack it up correctly. So they hopped online, they opened the return request, eBay gave them the label, they printed that label, they took the printer, they threw it in the box, they slapped the label on the outside and dropped it off at their post office the next day. They were probably completely frustrated. And me, as the seller, I need to start removing that from the process. I need to slow these returns down for the buyers. I need to give them an incentive to answer me when I ask them questions about why they're returning the item. Now, I still want to offer great customer service, and I still want to offer returns. If the clothing doesn't fit, there's nothing I can do. But like with this one, if it's an expensive printer and they can't get it to print, more than likely it's probably just some kind of setup issue that I can walk them through and save the expense of the return. Even though this is going to create a lot more work for me because I'm going to have to slow down the return process and handle the returns myself, it is worth it because I don't want the buyer returning items when they're frustrated. I want them on my timeline. I want to give them the label when I feel like giving them the label. I want to make it a little bit more difficult for the buyer to actually return these items. I want to reach out to the buyer and ask them a question and have them have an incentive to answer me rather than just, I already slapped the label on it and it's already been sent back to you. So the way I'm doing this is by turning on the setting RMA. And the way to do this is you go on the eBay, you go to My Seller Hub, you click on Orders, you click on Returns, you click on Return Preferences, and you turn on RMA number. This means that I'm going to have to provide a RMA number, which is just a made-up number for every return, and eBay is no longer going to just automatically hand the buyer a label. This is going to be great because this means that when the buyer is frustrated about the printer not working and they go on and open a return request, so that gives me some time to reach out to them. So I'm not going to give them that label immediately. Instead, I'm going to send that message and hopefully wait them out. I'm going to wait until that last day or until I get a response and try to help them get this item worked out. This is going to slow down the buyer. This means that the buyer can no longer be in the heat of the moment returning the item. The buyer's going to have to find time later when I give them the label to actually go and return the item. The buyer's going to have to go on to eBay or check their email to get the label. They're not just going to get it instantly, print it, and be able to drop it off immediately. Now, I do want to be clear. I'm not trying to avoid returns. Like, I understand things are going to arrive broken. I understand things aren't going to work. Things aren't going to fit. People aren't going to like things. And in those cases, I'm just going to automatically give them the label back. But on these high dollar, expensive items where the buyer doesn't want to be bothered actually trying to set up the item correctly, I'm going to slow down their process. And I think by even slowing down the item doesn't fit by a day or two is going to make the difference. Because if they get a pair of jeans and they don't fit, they're going to hop on and open up that return request. And when they don't get the label immediately, they're going to have to put those jeans over here to the side and then remember to go back and print that label at a later time and go and ship that label later rather than right then in the moment when they're actually dealing with the issue. I think this is going to lower my return rate overall. My return rate right now is actually pretty low. For selling electronics, for selling clothing, I have a 1.35% return rate, which is actually fairly low for the kind of items I'm selling. The reason it's so low is because I take good photographs, I describe items correctly, I take measurements of everything, and I make sure that everything is noted in the descriptions. This makes it very easy for buyers to actually know what they're buying. I'm not trying to trick anyone. I'm not trying to get people to keep items that they don't want, but I am trying to slow down that return process. And hopefully I can get my return rate under 1% by just slowing down these returns. Because in this case, if I could have talked to that buyer and figured out that it was a calibration issue, and I could have sent them some instructions on how to calibrate that printer for them, we may have avoided this whole thing. Not only would the buyer have avoided the frustration and just thrown the item back in the box, but the buyer may have actually gotten the item working, and I would have avoided paying the shipping both ways. If I can reach out to the buyer and ask them for more information and try to troubleshoot an item to keep a return from coming back, I'm going to do that. And by slowing down them getting that return label, they're going to be less likely to actually return the items. I am now in control of my returns and how I receive those returns and when I receive those returns. Those buyers are now on my timeline, not when eBay gives them the label immediately. If you've enjoyed this video, I think you're going to love this one, so go ahead and give it a click.